Most people think the Vanderbilt mansions are symbols of success. But what if they're actually monuments to failure? Behind these marble walls and golden staircases lies a story no one expects: how one of the richest families in American history built palaces so expensive, so massive, they helped destroy the fortune that created them. This is not a story about scandal. It's about scale, about wealth that grew faster than it could survive, and about how America's most powerful dynasty learned too late that money alone does not create permanence. This is the dark story of the Vanderbilt mansions. At the close of the 19th century, America stood in the unfamiliar position of having grown rich faster than it had grown old. Fortunes appeared in a single lifetime, sometimes in a single decade, drawn from railroads that stitched the continent together and from industries that converted raw expansion into measurable power. No family embodied this transformation more completely than the Vanderbilts. Their name, once attached to ferry routes and shipping lines, became synonymous with American industrial might, and later, with architectural excess on a scale previously reserved for European monarchies. To understand the Vanderbilt mansions is to understand not only the ambitions of one family, but the psychology of an era that believed wealth, once accumulated, could be made permanent through stone, marble, and steel. The rise of the Vanderbilt fortune began not in ballrooms or drawing rooms, but on the water. Cornelius Vanderbilt, born in 1794 on Staten Island, entered commerce early, navigating small boats between Manhattan and the surrounding islands. By the time the Industrial Revolution accelerated in America, Vanderbilt had mastered transportation logistics, first through shipping, then through railroads, ultimately consolidating control over critical corridors of movement. His wealth was not inherited, but engineered, built through relentless competition, legal maneuvering, and an instinctive understanding that transportation equaled leverage. By the time of his death in 1877, Vanderbilt was one of the richest men in American history, leaving behind a fortune estimated at over $100 million, an almost unimaginable sum in a nation still measuring itself against Europe. Yet Cornelius Vanderbilt himself lived comparatively modestly. The architectural explosion associated with the family would not fully materialize until the second generation inherited both his capital and his unresolved question: how should an American dynasty display legitimacy? In Europe, wealth had long been stabilized through land, castles, and aristocratic lineage. In the United States, new money carried an ease. Fortunes could rise quickly, but they could also evaporate just as fast. For the Vanderbilts, architecture became a solution to this instability, a way to convert volatile capital into immovable monuments. The transformation began along New York's Fifth Avenue, which during the late 19th century evolved from a residential street into a ceremonial corridor of power. William Henry Vanderbilt, Cornelius's eldest son, embraced display more openly than his father ever had. Under his direction, the family began constructing mansions that rivaled European palaces in size and cost. These homes were not simply residences. They were public declarations, designed to communicate permanence in a society that had none guaranteed. Architectural firms like McKim, Mead and White, and Hunt were enlisted to translate wealth into form. French Renaissance styles, Italian palazzo aesthetics, and Beaux Arts grandeur appeared along Manhattan blocks once occupied by modest townhouses. Marble staircases rose beneath painted ceilings. Imported tapestries lined walls designed to impress visiting dignitaries, industrial rivals, and social gatekeepers. The interiors were curated as carefully as museum collections, blending old world references with new world ambition. Yet even as these structures took shape, the social environment that justified them remained unstable. The Gilded Age, a term popularized by Mark Twain, was characterized by extraordinary wealth alongside widespread inequality. Beneath the polished facades of Vanderbilt mansions lay labor unrest, financial speculation, and economic cycles increasingly prone to collapse. The architecture masked fragility, both personal and systemic. Every mansion was an attempt to freeze time, to assert that the family's dominance would outlast the unpredictable forces that had created it. The most emblematic of these urban palaces was the William K. Vanderbilt House at 5th Avenue and 52nd Street, completed in the 1870s. Designed in the French chateau style, it stood as a symbol of transatlantic aspiration, an American attempt to replicate aristocratic Europe on domestic soil. But such structures were expensive beyond their initial construction. Staff salaries, maintenance, imported materials, and constant renovations created a permanent drain on even the largest fortunes. These homes consumed wealth as efficiently as they displayed it. As the family expanded, so did the scale of their architectural ambitions. Perhaps nowhere was this more pronounced than in Newport, Rhode Island, where the Vanderbilts built summer cottages that were cottages in name only. Marble House, the Breakers, and later Belcourt Castle stood along the Atlantic coast as seasonal expressions of power. Marble House alone cost an estimated $11 million in the 1890s, the majority spent on imported marble from Europe. It was a wedding gift, but also a monument, signaling that the family's wealth could transform entire landscapes. Yet Newport revealed something subtle and unsettling. These mansions were occupied only a few weeks each year. Entire staffs were hired to maintain homes that stood largely empty. Wealth, once concentrated and productive, was now immobilized in buildings that generated no income. The capital that had once fueled rail expansion and industrial growth was increasingly diverted into architectural preservation of status. The mansions became symbols not only of success, but of financial inertia. This pattern intensified with the construction of Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, completed in 1895 for George Washington Vanderbilt II. Biltmore was unprecedented in American residential architecture, a 250-room chateau inspired by the Loire Valley, surrounded by thousands of acres of carefully managed landscape designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. It was not merely a home but a self-contained world, complete with farms, forests, and industrial-scale maintenance operations. Biltmore represented the apex of Vanderbilt ambition, the fullest expression of the belief that wealth could be made eternal through scale. But scale carried consequences. Biltmore required constant funding, and its owner, unlike earlier Vanderbilts, was less engaged in aggressive wealth generation. George Vanderbilt was a scholar and collector, more interested in books and culture than rail consolidation. His estate consumed money without replacing it. What had once been a fortune driven by expansion had shifted toward preservation, a subtle but decisive change in financial orientation. As the 20th century approached, the foundations beneath the Vanderbilt empire began to shift. Railroads faced regulation, competition, and declining profitability. Antitrust laws limited consolidation. Economic downturns exposed the vulnerability of families whose wealth was tied to outdated industries. Meanwhile, the mansions remained, demanding care regardless of economic conditions. The buildings did not shrink when fortunes did. They became fixed costs in a world that no longer guaranteed fixed power. By the early decades of the 20th century, the Vanderbilt family found itself owning some of the most impressive residences ever constructed in America, while simultaneously struggling to sustain the wealth that had built them. Some mansions were sold, others were demolished. Fifth Avenue, once a corridor of dynastic pride, was gradually transformed into commercial real estate. Palaces gave way to skyscrapers. The permanence the Vanderbilt sought through architecture proved illusory. The collapse of the Vanderbilt architectural empire was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, through inheritance, divisions, changing economic structures, and a nation redefining its relationship with wealth and display. The mansions did not fail because they were poorly built. They failed because they belonged to an economic philosophy that could not survive modernity. Stone could not stabilize capital. Scale could not prevent decline. In this way, the Vanderbilt mansions tell a story larger than one family. They reveal the limits of architectural symbolism as a substitute for sustainable power. They expose the quiet truth beneath the Gilded Age, that excess, when disconnected from renewal, becomes a liability. And as America moved forward, these great houses remained behind, silent witnesses to a moment when wealth believed itself immortal. By the first years of the 20th century, the Vanderbilt mansions no longer functioned merely as homes. They had become systems complex, expensive organisms that required constant labor, constant capital, and constant justification. Each building represented not only architectural ambition, but a permanent financial obligation, one that could not be scaled down when economic conditions shifted. Unlike rail lines, which could be merged, sold, or abandoned, a marble palace could only be maintained or surrendered. This distinction would quietly reshape the family's future. The inheritance structure itself accelerated this pressure. Cornelius Vanderbilt had concentrated wealth through control. His descendants dispersed it through division. As estates were divided among children and grandchildren, the fortune fragmented while the buildings remained whole. A single mansion often passed to an heir whose personal income could no longer support it. The cost of servants, repairs, heating, and imported materials continued regardless of whether the owner possessed the industrial leverage of previous generations. The mansions assumed a kind of gravitational pull, drawing resources inward even as the family's financial center weakened. At the same time, the cultural landscape that had once celebrated architectural excess began to shift. The Progressive Era introduced skepticism toward concentrated wealth and public scrutiny of elite lifestyles. Journalists and reformers increasingly framed Gilded Age fortunes as symbols of imbalance rather than progress. What had once impressed began to provoke discomfort. A Fifth Avenue palace, once a declaration of success, now risked becoming an indictment of excess. This change was particularly evident in New York City, where real estate values rose sharply and land itself became more valuable than the residences built upon it. Commercial developers saw opportunity where families saw obligation. Taxes increased. Maintenance costs climbed. The Vanderbilts, possessing some of the most desirable urban land in America, faced a paradox. Their greatest assets had become liabilities unless converted into something more economically flexible. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the process of demolition began. One by one, the great Fifth Avenue mansions disappeared. The William K. Vanderbilt House, once a centerpiece of aristocratic aspiration, was demolished in the 1920s. Others followed. In their place rose office buildings, retail spaces, and hotel structures designed not to symbolize permanence, but to generate revenue. The street itself transformed from a private promenade into a commercial artery. The disappearance of the mansions was not merely architectural. It marked the end of a social order that had believed domestic space could substitute for hereditary title. Outside the city, the same pressures unfolded, more quietly, but no less decisively. Newport's summer palaces, dependent on seasonal occupation, became increasingly difficult to justify. The social rituals that had animated them faded as travel patterns changed and new forms of leisure emerged. Staffs were reduced. Wings were closed. Some properties were sold to preservation societies. Others slipped into neglect. The Atlantic wind eroded stone that wealth could no longer protect. Biltmore Estate, the largest and most ambitious of all Vanderbilt residences, survived only through reinvention. After George Vanderbilt's death in 1914, his widow, Edith Stuyvesant Dresser Vanderbilt, faced mounting financial strain. The estate's scale, once its triumph, became its burden. Maintaining thousands of acres and hundreds of rooms required income that private fortune alone could no longer reliably supply. Gradually, the estate opened to the public. What had been built as a private world became a managed attraction, sustained not by inheritance, but by admission fees and tourism. This transformation was emblematic of a broader shift. The Vanderbilt mansions that endured did so by abandoning their original purpose. They ceased to function as symbols of living power and instead became artifacts, museums, institutions, or preserved remnants of a vanished economic order. Their survival depended on collective interest rather than individual dominance. Meanwhile, the industries that had produced the original fortune continued to decline in relative importance. Railroads, once the arteries of national growth, faced competition from automobiles, trucking, and aviation. Regulation constrained profits. The leverage that had once allowed a single family to shape entire markets dissolved into corporate bureaucracy and federal oversight. Wealth, increasingly abstract and financialized, no longer expressed itself through architecture in the same way. By the mid-20th century, the Vanderbilt name still carried historical weight, but little contemporary power. The contrast between surviving estates and lost fortunes became stark. Buildings endured where economic dominance did not. The mansions stood as physical reminders of a moment when Americans believed that scale itself could guarantee legacy. Yet these structures also revealed the flaw in that belief. Architecture can preserve memory, but it cannot generate renewal on its own. The Vanderbilt mansions did not fail because they were poorly conceived or badly built. They failed because they attempted to freeze a social hierarchy that depended on conditions too volatile to sustain. Stone could outlast people, but not economic logic. As visitors now walk through preserved halls and landscaped grounds, they encounter not simply luxury, but absence. The rooms are intact, but the world that animated them has dissolved. The silence is instructive. It speaks of a time when wealth sought immortality through architecture, and of the quiet realization that permanence, once assumed, must be continually earned. In this sense, the collapse of America's Gilded Age fortune was not a single event, but a gradual awakening. The Vanderbilt mansions remain, scattered and transformed, as monuments not to triumph, but to the limits of excess. They are lessons rendered in limestone and marble, reminding a modern audience that even the grandest structures stand on economic ground that can shift beneath them. The Vanderbilt mansions still stand, or rather, they persist. Some survive intact behind admission gates and velvet ropes. Others exist only in photographs and foundation stones buried beneath modern streets. What remains is not the power that built them, but the evidence of it. These structures no longer command industry or shape markets. They instruct instead. They remind us that wealth, when mistaken for permanence, often chooses the most fragile form in which to preserve itself. The Gilded Age believed stone could anchor fortune against time. The Vanderbilts believed scale could substitute for continuity. Yet history moved faster than marble, and economics proved less sentimental than architecture. What endures is not the dynasty, but the question their legacy leaves behind, whether excess ever truly protects what it seeks to preserve. As the doors close and the lights dim inside these great houses, they do not feel empty. They feel resolved. Their silence is complete, their purpose fulfilled not as homes of power, but as monuments to a moment when America learned that even its grandest fortunes were temporary.